While the university is commonly understood to be a place where different knowledge systems enter into dialogue and debate, the institutional structures of the university tend to acculturate and conscript different kinds of knowledge into their own existing categories for what can be known, how knowledge can be organized, and what forms of knowledge are legitimate and credible. The Different Knowing speaker series and interviews address the question of if and how the university can be a place of different knowings, different epistemologies, different knowledges.
I think one is that, and this is interesting to think about your theme of different knowings. I think one of the things in Indigenous studies that we have to do is we have to not allow European epistemologies to set the norm for what is and isn't distinctive. And I feel like what happens is that outsiders to Indigenous cultures expect and often require what I would call radical distinctiveness. That nothing gets to count as native unless it is radically different from things that we think of as European. But the reality is, 2,000 years ago, when Europe did not have any very large cities or very sophisticated means for dealing with things like sewage and garbage and water, when they were struggling with all that and living in relatively small groupings, there were large cities in the Americas. 1,000 years ago, Cahokia had probably 10,000 people in a 6 square mile area that had a palisade around it and huge earthworks. Blood Run may have had 10,000 people. When you go further down, go to Chaco Canyon, it's a huge city in what's now the U.S. Southwest. Tenochtitlan, when Cortez is arriving, is a huge city, an Aztec city. You keep going further south, the Mayan cities, a place like Tikal is just massive, massive. Plazas engineered to sluice water into reservoirs to support thousands of people. It's designed to support thousands of people where there's not a permanent water source. That's a huge feat of engineering, planning, right? They built it there because that's where the rock was, the source for the quarry. And then further down, we have the Incan cities as well, Machu Picchu and other places. They're all large-scale cities. And so I think it's a mistake to think that somehow being urban is an equation to being European. And we have allowed the history of the decimation of the Americas by disease and the resultant small-scale societies that were often left to sort of define what's the norm. So that we think now that tribal peoples mean small-scale, when the reality of the Americas over thousands of years would have been a combination of large urban areas and trade centers, and then basically suburbs, smaller villages, towns, depending on the environment and depending on different historical movements as people migrated across different places as the weather changed. We know all of that in the abstract, but the stereotypes about Native people living in small groups with no technology really persist. That also tells us that people were not monocultural, not monolingual, and that people were not afraid of cultural difference. That's also, I think, some of the stereotypes is that Native people are insular, inward-looking, and fragile, right? The idea that if they come into contact with outsiders, they lose their culture very quickly. But we know that people were moving